March 6, 1944, 52,000 feet above Berlin. The altitude was impossible. Hauptmann Johannes Mackie Steinhoff, Gruppenkommandeur of JG 77 and a veteran of over 400 combat missions, checked his instruments twice, certain they were malfunctioning. His Messerschmitt BSF 109 G6, one of Germany's finest interceptors, was struggling at 38,000 feet, the engine gasping for oxygen in the thin stratospheric air. The supercharger screamed in protest as it fought to compress the nearly non-existent atmosphere into something combustible. But the contrails above him were real. Impossible, he muttered into his oxygen mask, his breath crystallizing instantly in the -60 degrees Fahrenheit cockpit. Nothing can fly that high with a combat load. The American bombers were returning from Berlin, 300 B-17 flying fortresses in a formation that stretched for miles across the frozen sky. And above them, impossibly high, were their escorts, sleek, shark-like silhouettes with distinctive belly radiator scoops and bubble canopies that gave their pilots unobstructed vision in every direction. P-51 Mustangs. Steinhoff had been briefed about them. The intelligence reports from Oberkommando der Luftwaffe had been dismissive. American fighter built to British specifications using a rejected Allison engine. Performance adequate at low altitude only. No threat to our interceptors above 15,000 feet. The Merlin engine variants show improved altitude performance, but remain inferior to our BF 109 and FW 190 designs in all meaningful parameters. The reports were 6 months old. They were catastrophically wrong. Indiana! Indiana! The warning call crackled through Steinhoff's headset. Coming down from the sun! Mustangs at 40,000. 4 P-51Ds of the 357th Fighter Group, flying top cover at an altitude no German intelligence officer had thought possible for a fighter carrying drop tanks and full ammunition, rolled inverted and dove. Major Thomas Hayes, leading the flight, had spotted Steinhoff's formation positioning for a bomber attack. The mathematics of interception were already calculated in Hayes's mind. Altitude advantage, energy state, closing speed, deflection angle. The Mustangs came down like silver hammers from heaven. Steinhoff reacted instantly, instinct from hundreds of combats taking over. He chopped throttle, snapped into a hard left turn, and dove, trading his precious altitude for speed. His wingman, Lieutenant Franz Stiegler, not the same Stigler who would later become famous for escorting a damaged B-17, followed, their 2 aircraft executing the textbook evasion that had saved German pilots countless times against Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and Soviet fighters. It didn't work. The lead Mustang followed them down, not just matching their dive, but exceeding it. Steinhoff's airspeed indicator climbed past 400 miles per hour, then 450, then 500. His controls stiffened as shockwaves formed on his wings, the Messerschmitt approaching the edge of compressibility. The Mustang behind him was still accelerating. At 500 miles per hour, the P-51's 6.50 caliber machine guns spoke. Steinhoff saw the traces before he heard them, glowing lines of death that seemed to bend through space, converging on a point just ahead of his canopy. Then the sound, not the rattling burst of German weapons, but a sustained roar, like industrial machinery, like a factory producing destruction. The shells, 100 of them in the 2-second burst, walked up his Messerschmitt from tail to cockpit. The first rounds shattered his rudder. The next group exploded through his elevator controls. The final rounds punched through his armored headrest, one passing so close to his skull that he felt the supersonic crack against his helmet. His aircraft, one of Germany's most advanced fighters, flown by an ace with 176 victories, became an uncontrollable coffin falling through 30,000 feet of freezing sky. Steinhoff managed to bail out at 12,000 feet, watching his Messerschmitt spiral into a Prussian forest below. As his parachute deployed, he looked up and saw the Mustang that had killed his fighter. It wasn't pursuing. It didn't need to. It had already climbed back to 40,000 feet, resuming its position above the bomber stream, ready to kill again. The American pilot, Hayes, would claim his 7th victory that day. Steinhoff would spend the rest of the war in a hospital, his back broken during the high-speed bailout. But before he lost consciousness, Hanging in his parachute harness with vertebrae compressed and legs numb, Johannes Steinhoff had one final coherent thought. We were told this aircraft was inferior. We were told wrong, and that lie is going to cost us the war. What Hauptmann Steinhoff experienced on that frozen March morning was the culmination of one of the most dramatic reversals in military aviation history. The North American P-51 Mustang had entered service just 28 months earlier as a fighter so flawed, so fundamentally compromised in its initial form, that both American and British air forces had rejected it for frontline combat roles. German technical intelligence, upon examining early reconnaissance photos and captured examples, had dismissed it as evidence of Anglo-American desperation, a mediocre design rushed into production by nations that didn't understand fighter aircraft. By March 1944, that same aircraft was systematically destroying the Luftwaffe's fighter force in a campaign of annihilation that would leave German air power a smoking ruin within 12 months. This is the story of how the most underestimated fighter of World War II became the most feared. How an aircraft born from a British procurement crisis and salvaged by a British engine became the long arm of American air power, reaching deep into the heart of Nazi Germany to strangle the Luftwaffe in its own sky. The transformation would be driven by three factors that German intelligence consistently failed to understand: the revolutionary marriage of American aerodynamics with British engine technology, the industrial capacity to iterate and improve at a pace Germany couldn't match, and the mathematical inevitability of a fighter that could escort bombers anywhere in Europe while maintaining enough performance to dominate every German interceptor it encountered. The numbers would tell the story. The Mustang would destroy more enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat than any other Allied fighter. 4,950 German aircraft confirmed, with thousands more probables. It would achieve a kill ratio of 19-1 against the Luftwaffe. It would escort bombers to Berlin and back, 1,600 miles round trip, a feat German engineers had calculated was aerodynamically impossible for a single-engine fighter. But behind the statistics lay something more devastating: psychological dominance. German pilots who had faced Spitfires, Thunderbolts, and Soviet Yaks without braking developed a specific, paralyzing fear of the Mustang. They called it Langnasenjäger, the long-nose hunter. The distinctive profile of the P-51's nose, stretched forward by its liquid-cooled engine, became synonymous with inescapable death. By war's end, the appearance of Mustangs over a German airfield meant one thing: the mission was over before it began. You could take off and die, or stay on the ground and preserve your aircraft for a few more hours. Either way, the outcome was inevitable. The aircraft that accomplished this had been laughed at by the same German engineers who designed the Bf-109 and FW-190. Their technical assessments, preserved in captured Luftwaffe intelligence files, reveal a stunning failure of analysis, a case study in how preconceptions, institutional bias, and incomplete data can lead to catastrophic misunderstanding of an opponent's capabilities. The German scientists had laughed. Then they had died, along with the fighter pilots they sent into combat, with inadequate warnings and false confidence. The P-51 Mustang was born from desperation, not inspiration, and it entered the world as nobody's first choice. April 1940. The British Purchasing Commission, operating out of a requisitioned hotel in New York City, faced a crisis. The Royal Air Force was bleeding fighters over France and the English Channel. Spitfire and Hurricane production couldn't keep pace with combat losses. Britain needed fighters, thousands of them, and needed them immediately. The Commission approached Curtiss Wright Corporation, hoping to license produce the P-40 Warhawk. But Curtiss was already at capacity producing P-40S for the U.S. Army Air Corps, and couldn't add a British production line for at least 18 months. The Commission's representatives, desperate for any solution, approached North American Aviation almost as an afterthought. North American Aviation had never built a fighter aircraft. They manufactured trainers, the 86 Texan primarily, and had no fighter design experience whatsoever. When British representatives met with North American's Vice President and General Manager, James Howard Dutch Kindleberger, On April 10, 1940, they expected a polite rejection. Instead, Kindleberger made an audacious proposal. "Give us 120 days, and we'll design and build you something better than the P-40. The British Commission's lead negotiator, Air Commodore Reginald Peck, laughed. "Mr. Kindleberger, the P-40 took Curtiss 3 years to develop. You're telling me you'll design a completely new fighter from nothing in 4 months?" "Not from nothing," Kindleberger replied. "We've been studying every fighter design in existence. We know what works and what doesn't. We know what the P-40 gets wrong. Give us a contract and we'll prove it." The British, having no better options, agreed. The contract signed on May 29, 1940, called for 320 aircraft, designated the NA-73, later named Mustang by the British. The penalty for failure was simple. North American aviation would go bankrupt. What followed was the most intense aircraft design effort of the war. Chief designer Edgar Schmood, a German emigrant who had left Bavaria in 1925 after the Treaty of Versailles killed Germany's aviation industry, led a team of 25 engineers working 16-hour days, 7 days a week. Schmood's design philosophy was revolutionary. While German and British fighters prioritized maneuverability and climb rate, accepting high drag and limited range as inevitable compromises, Schmood became obsessed with laminar flow, the principle that smooth airflow over a wing's surface could dramatically reduce drag. "Every other fighter is designed to turn and climb," Schmood told his team in a meeting documented in North American's project files. "But turning and climbing burn fuel, they limit range. The British need a fighter that can reach deep into occupied Europe, that can fly for hours, that can go places and do things no other fighter can do. To achieve that, we must minimize drag. Everything else is secondary." The result was the most aerodynamically refined fighter of its era. The NA-73's wing used a NACA 45-100 laminar flow airfoil, completely smooth surfaces with flush riveting throughout, and a design that pushed the maximum thickness point further back than conventional wings. In wind tunnel testing, the Mustang's wing produced 65% less drag than a Spitfire's wing at cruise speeds. The fuselage was similarly optimized. The belly-mounted radiator intake, initially criticized as vulnerable, was positioned to use the cooling airflow for additional thrust. The Meredith effect, first theorized in the 1930s, but never successfully implemented on a fighter aircraft. The radiator actually produced net thrust at high speed, turning a necessary drag-producing component into a performance advantage. On October 26, 1940, exactly 117 days after contract signing, test pilot Vance Breese lifted the first NA-73X prototype into the California sky from Mines Field, later Los Angeles International Airport. The aircraft flew beautifully, handling precisely and stably, with exceptionally light control forces. But there was a problem, a catastrophic, mission-killing problem that would nearly doom the Mustang before it ever reached combat. The engine was terrible. North American had installed the Allison V1 710, a 1,100 horsepower liquid-cooled V12 that was readily available and already in production for the P-40. It was a fine engine at a low altitude, but above 15,000 feet, its single-stage, single-speed supercharger couldn't compress enough air to maintain power. At 20,000 feet, the Allison produced barely 700 horsepower. At 25,000 feet, it was wheezing at 500 horsepower. German fighters, meanwhile, used engines with sophisticated two-stage superchargers that maintained power up to 30,000 feet or higher. The Bf-109's Daimler-Benz DB601 and 605 series, the FW-190's BMW-801, all were optimized for high-altitude combat. The early Mustang Mackay fighters that reached Britain in October 1941 confirmed the worst fears. At altitudes above 15,000 feet, where most combat occurred, the Mustang was comprehensively outclassed by German fighters. It was fast, maneuverable, and beautifully made, and completely unsuitable for its intended role. British test pilot Ronald Harker flew a Mustang Mark I at RAF Duxford in April 1942 and immediately recognized both the problem and the solution. In his after-action report to Rolls-Royce, he wrote, "This airframe is exceptional. The problem is the power plant. Install a Merlin, and you'll have the finest fighter in the world." The Merlin, Rolls-Royce's legendary two-stage, two-speed supercharged engine that powered the Spitfire, produced 1,620 horsepower at takeoff and maintained over 1,000 horsepower up to 30,000 feet. It was everything the Allison wasn't. Rolls-Royce engineers, working in parallel with North American's team in California, began modification studies immediately. The first Merlin-powered Mustang, the Mustang X, serial AL975, flew on October 13, 1942 at Hucknall Aerodrome. Test pilot Ronald Harker's flight report, preserved in Rolls-Royce archives, was ecstatic. Performance transformed. Climbs to 20,000 feet in under 6 minutes. Speed at 25,000 feet exceeds 420 miles per hour. Above 25,000 feet, faster than any aircraft we have tested, including late-model Spitfires. Handling remains superb. No vices. Conclude this variant represents step change in fighter capability. The United States Army Air Forces, initially dismissive of the Mustang, ordered 2,000 Merlin-powered P-51Bs immediately after reviewing British test data. The Packard Motor Company in Detroit, already licensed-producing Merlins as the V1650, tooled up for mass production. The P-51B flew combat for the first time December 1, 1943, escorting bombers to Kiel, Germany. Finally, 40 months after Kindleberger's audacious promise, the Mustang was ready to prove itself in the role it was designed for. German intelligence had been monitoring Mustang development through reconnaissance flights, captured documents, and interrogation of downed pilots. The assessments, compiled by Oberkommando der Luftwaffe's Technical Intelligence Branch, reveal a stunning pattern of miscalculation. A report dated November 1943, 1 month before the P-51B's combat debut, concluded, "The Mustang with Merlin engine shows improved high-altitude performance, but remains fundamentally compromised by its design philosophy. The emphasis on range requires internal fuel capacity that makes the aircraft heavy and sluggish. The belly radiator remains a critical vulnerability. The wing loading is excessive for dogfighting. Assessment: suitable for reconnaissance and ground attack only. No significant threat to our interceptor force." The German scientists had examined the data, applied their preconceptions about fighter design, and reached conclusions that would soon be written in the blood of their own pilots. They had laughed at an aircraft they didn't understand. The joke was about to turn lethal. The P-51B Mustang entered combat over Europe, with high expectations, and immediately struggled to meet them. January 11th, 1944. 8th Fighter Command launched its first major bomber escort mission deep into Germany, with P-51Bs. The 354th Fighter Group, attached to the 9th Fighter Command but flying escort duty, was tasked with protecting B-17 bombers attacking Oskersleben and Brunswick, targets 300 miles inside Germany that Thunderbolts couldn't reach. The mission was a disaster for the Green Mustang pilots. Lieutenant Colonel James Howard, commanding the 354th, led 49 P-51Bs into German airspace. They encountered BF-10-9s and FW-19s from JG-1, JG-11, and JG-26, elite units with veteran pilots who had been fighting since 1940. The Americans, most with fewer than 50 hours in the Mustang and zero combat experience, were massacred tactically, if not materially. The Luftwaffe pilots employed their standard tactics, hit-and-run attacks from high altitude, using superior altitude performance to dictate engagement terms. The P-51B pilots, trained to think of their aircraft as superior in every way, tried to dogfight and found themselves outmaneuvered. The Mustang, for all its speed and range, had handling quirks that killed inexperienced pilots. The laminar flow wing that produced such low drag also produced unpredictable stall characteristics. Unlike the forgiving Spitfire or rugged Thunderbolt, the Mustang's wing would suddenly snatch at stall speed, a violent, uncommanded roll that could flip the aircraft inverted in a fraction of a second. In a tight turn during combat, at high altitude, with the pilot focused on tracking a target, this snatching killed. Second Lieutenant Richard Turner of the 354's 353 Fighter Squadron died this way on January 11th. Pursuing a BF-109 in a climbing turn at 28,000 feet, he pulled too hard. The wing snatched, and his P-51B snapped inverted and entered an inverted spin. He never recovered, auguring into farmland near Hanover. His body was found still strapped in the cockpit, hands locked on the stick, having fought the aircraft all the way down. The gun armament created even worse problems. The P-51B mounted 4.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns in the wings, 2 per side. In the frigid air at 25,000 to 30,000 feet, the guns froze. The electrically heated gun compartments, adequate for testing in California, proved insufficient for sustained combat in European winter. On January 24th, during an escort mission to Frankfurt, Major James Howard, no relation to the 354th's commander, of the 356th Fighter Squadron, found himself alone, separated from his formation, facing approximately 30 German fighters attacking a B-17 formation. Howard dove into the German formation and began engaging multiple targets. His left side guns froze after 2 bursts. Then his right inboard gun jammed. He continued fighting with one functioning gun, making repeated attacks over a 30-minute period, disrupting the German assault long enough for the bombers to reach friendly airspace. For this action, he would receive the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater so honored. But the after-action report told a darker story. Single functioning weapon insufficient to ensure kills. Observed strikes on multiple enemy aircraft. Cannot confirm any destroyed. Aggressive maneuvering deterred attacks but did not achieve primary mission of destroying enemy fighters. The gun problems persisted through February. Modifications were attempted, improved heating elements, different lubricants, enclosed gun bays. Nothing worked consistently. Pilots reported functional guns at takeoff becoming frozen solid within 30 minutes at combat altitude. Meanwhile, the Germans were learning to exploit the Mustang's weaknesses. Oberst Hannes Trautloft, commanding JG-54, circulated tactical guidance to all units based on early encounters. The American Mustang relies on speed and range. It cannot sustain tight turns without loss of energy. It cannot accelerate quickly from slow speed due to high wing loading. Engage from below, force climbing turns, disengage vertically. The Mustang pilot who tries to follow will stall or overstress his airframe. When pursuing Mustangs, use aileron rolls rather than sustained turns. Their aileron response is poor at high speed. The intelligence was largely accurate. The P-51B's ailerons, operated by push rods rather than cables, became heavy at high speed. Over 400 miles per hour, the stick forces required to initiate a roll exceeded 50 pounds. German pilots using their fighters' superior roll rate could evade at speeds where Mustang pilots physically couldn't follow. Losses mounted. In February 1944, 8th Fighter Command lost 33 P-51s in aerial combat, with an additional 16 destroyed in accidents, mostly handling-related mishaps during combat maneuvering. The victories claimed totaled 89 German aircraft, but only 42 were confirmed. The exchange ratio, barely 1.3 to 1, was far below expectations and inferior to the P-47 Thunderbolt's performance over the same period. Major Glenn Eagleston, who would eventually become a 18.5 victory ace, recalled the early months in a 1987 interview. "We thought we had the best fighter in the world. The briefings told us we were superior to anything Germany had. Then we got to combat and discovered we were fighting in an aircraft we didn't fully understand, against pilots who'd been at war for 4 years. The Mustang had all this potential, but we hadn't figured out how to use it, and guys were dying while we learned." The gun armament issue came to a head in March 1944 when a technical board convened at 8th Fighter Command headquarters recommended increasing the P-51's armament from 4 guns to 6. The modification was already in development. The P-51D would mount 6.50 calibers with improved heating and enclosed bays, but the D model wouldn't reach squadrons until May at the earliest. In the meantime, the 4-gun Mustangs continued flying missions deep into Germany, their pilots knowing that at least one gun would likely fail at the worst possible moment. The Germans, monitoring American radio communications and debriefing captured pilots, began to sense that the Mustang wasn't the war winner they'd feared. A Luftwaffe intelligence summary from March 8, 1944 noted, "The P-51 achieves its range through large fuel capacity, resulting in weight penalty that degrades combat performance. Gun reliability problems confirmed by multiple captured pilots. Aircraft difficult to handle at stall and at high speed. Our pilots report success using vertical maneuvers and high-speed aileron rolls." Conclusion: the Mustang represents improved but not revolutionary capability. Properly trained pilots can engage on favorable terms. What German intelligence didn't realize was that American pilots were learning faster than the Luftwaffe could adapt. The terrible first months were producing combat-tested tactics, engineering fixes, and a cadre of experienced pilots who understood how to exploit the Mustang's true strengths while avoiding its weaknesses. The transformation was about to begin, and it would start with one mission that changed everything. March 8, 1944, 28,000 feet above Brandenburg, Germany. The mission that would redefine aerial warfare began with a communications failure. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, commanding the 487 Fighter Squadron of the 352 Fighter Group, checked his fuel gauges and swore quietly into his oxygen mask. The bomber formation they were supposed to escort, 180 B-17s striking ball-bearing factories in Erkner, was nowhere in sight. His 16 P-51Bs had arrived at the rendezvous point on time and at the correct altitude. The bombers hadn't. Radio discipline was strict. Luftwaffe monitoring stations tracked American formations by their transmissions. Meyer maintained radio silence and made a command decision that would have gotten him court-martialed if it had gone wrong. He would take his squadron hunting. "Spread out. Battle formation. We're going downtown," Meyer transmitted, using a brevity code that meant they were heading toward Berlin itself. What Meyer didn't know was that Luftwaffe controllers had vectored every available fighter in the region toward the incoming bomber stream. Over 150 German fighters, Bf-109s from JG-3, JG-27, and JG-53, FW-19s from JG-1 and JG-26, were climbing through 25,000 feet, positioning for mass attacks on the B-17 formations. Meyer's 16 Mustangs were about to stumble into the largest concentration of Luftwaffe fighters yet encountered over Berlin. At 10:47 a.m., Meyer spotted the first enemy aircraft, a swarm of 4 Bf-109 G6 from 3/JG-27, flown by experienced pilots who had rotated back from the Eastern Front. The Germans were in a climbing left turn, focused on gaining altitude advantage over the bombers they knew were approaching. They never saw the Mustangs. Meyer's tactical innovation in that moment would become doctrine for every Allied fighter group by year's end. Instead of engaging in traditional dogfighting, turning and burning, trying to get on the enemy's tail through maneuver, Meyer recognized the Mustang's true advantage: energy management. The P-51B, with its low-drag airframe and powerful Merlin engine, could maintain high speed at high altitude. It could also accelerate faster than any German fighter when pointed downhill. Most critically, it could zoom climb, convert speed to altitude more efficiently than anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. "Keep your speed up. Attack from above. One pass, break down and away. Use your speed," Meyer transmitted to his flight leaders. The 487th Squadron dove on the unsuspecting Bf-109s, each Mustang targeting a different German fighter. Meyer took the lead 109, closing from 7 o'clock high at a 30-degree deflection angle. The German pilot, Lieutenant Hans-Werner Winkler, a veteran with 27 kills on the Eastern Front, never knew death was coming. Meyer opened fire at 400 yards. All 4 guns functioned. The squadron had received upgraded heating elements just days earlier. 200 rounds poured out in a 3-second burst. The convergence point was set at 300 yards, creating a cone of destruction roughly 8 feet in diameter. Winkler's Bf-109 flew directly into that cone. The .50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary rounds struck the 109's thin rear fuselage, punching through aluminum skin and hitting the fuel tank located directly behind the cockpit. The incendiary compound, burning at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, ignited the fuel vapor. The Messerschmitt exploded, the fuselage breaking in half just behind the cockpit. Winkler was killed instantly, never having time to register that he was under attack. The remaining 3 109s saw their leader explode and reacted instinctively, breaking hard into the attack. This was the correct response to a traditional bounce. Turn into your attacker, force an overshoot, reverse the engagement. It was what their training had drilled into them through hundreds of sorties. It was exactly the wrong response against Mustangs employing boom and zoom tactics. Captain Donald Boschke, leading Meyer's second element, ignored the turning Germans and instead dove past them, extending away at full throttle. His wingman, First Lieutenant Walter Stark, followed. The 2 Mustangs accelerated past 450 miles per hour in a shallow dive, opening the range to over a mile in less than 30 seconds. The German pilots, seeing their attackers fleeing, attempted pursuit. This was the critical mistake. The Bf-10-9s, already at high altitude where their performance degraded, were now in a stern chase against aircraft accelerating away. To catch the Mustangs, the German pilots pushed their throttles forward, trading altitude for speed in a shallow dive. At 1,200 yards of separation, Boschke smoothly pulled his Mustang's nose up and began a zoom climb. The Merlin engine, still producing over 1,200 horsepower at 27,000 feet, pulled the P-51B upward like an elevator. Stark followed in perfect formation. The pursuing Bf-10-9s tried to follow the zoom climb. Their Daimler-Benz DB605 engines, producing perhaps 800 horsepower at altitude, couldn't match it. The Messerschmitts lost airspeed rapidly, their noses pointing skyward, but their altitude gain slowing, stopping. At the top of his zoom, now at 32,000 feet, with the Bf-10-9s 3,000 feet below him and barely moving, Boschke rolled inverted and dove again. This time, he was directly above the Germans, who were now slow, vulnerable, and out of energy. Like shooting fish in a barrel, Boschke reported after landing. His combat report continued. Selected the nearest 109. Dove to point-blank range, approximately 200 yards. Fired 4-second burst. Enemy aircraft disintegrated. Wings separated from fuselage. Climbed away. Selected second target. Repeated attack. Second aircraft exploded on impact. Pilot observed to bail out, but parachute did not deploy. In less than 4 minutes, Meyer's squadron had destroyed 7 German fighters without loss. The engagement demonstrated the fundamental mathematics that German pilots were only beginning to understand. The Mustang didn't need to turn better or climb faster than German fighters. It just needed to climb higher, dive faster, and accelerate quicker. These advantages, properly exploited, made traditional dogfighting irrelevant, but the main engagement was just beginning. At 10:53 a.m., Meyer's squadron reached the initial point where they expected to find bombers. Instead, they found a sky full of German fighters. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, not yet shot down as he would be later that month, was leading a coordinated attack by over 80 fighters from multiple Geschwader. The plan was to hit the B-17 formations simultaneously from multiple altitudes, overwhelming the bombers' defensive firepower through sheer numbers. Meyer's 16 Mustangs had just flown into the middle of this formation. "Holy shit!" Meyer transmitted, breaking radio discipline completely. "Bandits everywhere! All elements engage! Keep your speed up!" What followed was the most chaotic air battle over Berlin to that date. Meyer's after-action report, filed 3 days later after all pilots had been debriefed, runs to 37 single-spaced pages. The combat lasted 47 minutes and spread across 40 miles of sky. The key moment came when Meyer realized his squadron couldn't win through individual combat. 16 Mustangs against 80 German fighters, even with superior tactics, was a losing proposition through attrition. So Meyer did something unprecedented. He ignored the German fighters and went after their mission. "Forget the fighters. Get the bombers," Meyer transmitted. The B-17s, late to the rendezvous, were just entering the target area when Meyer's Mustangs found them. The bomber crews, expecting to face unescorted attacks from German fighters, instead saw P-51s arriving at their altitude, weaving through their formation, positioning between the bombers and the approaching German fighters. The psychological impact on both sides was immediate and profound. The American bomber crews, who had been fighting desperate battles of survival for months, suddenly felt invincible. The German fighter pilots, expecting an easy attack on undefended bombers, found themselves facing fighters that had just destroyed 7 of their comrades and were now positioned perfectly to interdict any bombing attack. Major Walter Dahl, leading JG-3's attack element, later described the moment in his memoir, Ramming Speed. "We saw the American heavy bombers, a beautiful sight, geometric formations that seemed to promise easy victories. Then we saw the Mustangs, not fleeing or dogfighting, but positioned exactly where they needed to be to defend the bombers, climbing above them, between us and them. Their pilots had made a calculated decision: defend the bombers at all costs. They were forcing us to fight through them to reach our targets. The Germans had no choice but to engage. The mission was to stop the bombers. To reach the bombers, they had to go through the Mustangs." Over the next 40 minutes, Meyer's squadron fought a series of running battles against numerically superior forces while maintaining their position relative to the bomber stream. The tactics were simple: stay fast, stay high, attack from above, break away before getting slow, never dogfight, never turn, always maintain energy. Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew demonstrated the tactic perfectly in an engagement that would make him an instant ace. Spotting a swarm of 4 FW-19s preparing to attack the bombers from below, Drew dove from 30,000 feet, accelerating past 500 miles per hour. He fired a single burst at the lead FW-190 at 350 yards, his guns producing a combined rate of fire of 2,800 rounds per minute, or 47 rounds per second. The burst lasted 1.5 seconds. Approximately 70 rounds hit the FW-190. The German fighter simply came apart, its wing folding upward and tearing away from the fuselage. The pilot, Feldwebel Otto Könke of JG-26, had no time to react. One moment he was leading his flight toward an attack run. The next moment his aircraft was debris falling through 25,000 feet of sky. Drew didn't watch the kill. He was already extending away at maximum speed, climbing back to altitude for another attack. 2 minutes later, he repeated the process against another FW-190, then again and again. By the time the bombers exited German airspace, Drew had shot down 5 German fighters in 38 minutes of combat. He had fired fewer than 1,200 rounds total, about 240 rounds per kill. None of his targets had time to effectively return fire. None of his victims had even seen him before his first burst hit them. The mathematics were devastating for the Germans. Meyer's squadron of 16 Mustangs had engaged approximately 80 German fighters over a 47-minute battle. The final tally: 27 German aircraft confirmed destroyed, 14 probably destroyed, 11 damaged. American losses: 2 Mustangs shot down, both pilots recovered, and 3 aircraft damaged, but returned to base. The exchange ratio, 13.5 to 1 in a numerically inferior engagement, sent shock waves through both air forces. More critically, not a single B-17 was lost to fighter attack during the mission. The bombers completed their run on the target, dropped their ordnance,